The icy winds howl across the Baltic Sea, biting through the sails of a lone merchant ship as it battles the waves. The deck creaks under the weight of barrels filled with furs, wax, and salt-precious cargo that could make or break fortunes. This is no ordinary voyage. Every gust of wind, every shadow on the horizon could mean pirates or rival traders waiting to strike. Yet the crew presses on, driven by something greater than fear, the promise of wealth, power, and a network of alliances stretching across northern Europe. This was the world of the Hanseatic League, a brotherhood of merchants who turned trade into an empire. How did a loose alliance of traders with no standing army or central ruler come to dominate commerce from London to Novgorod for over 400 years? At its peak, the Hanseatic League wasn't just a group of merchants, it was a shadow power dictating prices, forging treaties, and even toppling kings who stood in its way. Cities rose and fell by its favor, and its influence stretched far beyond the docks and market squares. But beneath the gold and glory lay secrets, rivalries, betrayals, and a slow unraveling that would eventually lead to its mysterious decline. This is the story of ambition, cunning, and the relentless pursuit of control. It's about how a handful of port cities, bound by mutual interest, reshaped the medieval world, and why their legacy still echoes in the trade routes and alliances of today. From whispered deals in candlelit guild halls to bloody confrontations on the high seas, the Hanseatic League's rise was anything but peaceful, and its fall even more dramatic. So settle in, because what you're about to discover isn't just history. It's a masterclass in power, strategy, and the art of building an empire without ever wearing a crown. Long before the Hanseatic League became a titan of trade, it was little more than a whisper between desperate men huddled in smoky taverns along the Baltic coast. In the mid-12th century, German merchants faced a brutal reality. The seas were lawless, pirates lurked in every cove, and local lords demanded exorbitant tolls just to let goods pass through their waters. Survival meant sticking together. Small groups began pooling resources, sharing ships, hiring armed escorts, even building makeshift warehouses in foreign ports to store goods safely. But the real turning point came when two cities, Lübeck and Hamburg, sealed a fateful agreement. Lübeck, with its deep harbor and strategic position, became the beating heart of this fledgling alliance. Hamburg, a gateway to the North Sea, offered access to the wider world. Together, they formed a lifeline. Goods could flow from the Baltic to the Atlantic without relying on hostile middlemen. But their partnership wasn't just about geography. It was built on trust, enforced by strict codes of conduct. Merchants who cheated their partners faced exile, their names blacklisted from every port in the network. Then came the Gotland traders, Swedish islanders who'd mastered commerce in the frigid north. These seasoned sailors didn't just bring furs and amber, they brought something far more valuable: connections. Through them, German merchants gained entry to Novgorod, a city bursting with Russian honey, wax, and timber. Suddenly, the alliance wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Yet unity didn't come easily. Rivalries simmered, and not every city was eager to share power. What held them together wasn't friendship, but cold, hard necessity. When storms sank ships or bandits raided caravans, merchants learned the hard way. Alone, they were targets. Together, they were untouchable. By the late 12th century, this loose web of partnerships had a name: the Hanse, from the old German word for guild. No one could have guessed it would soon rewrite the rules of medieval trade. The year 1226 marked a turning point for Lübeck, one that would echo through centuries of commerce. Emperor Frederick II, locked in power struggles across the Holy Roman Empire, made a fateful decision. He granted Lübeck an imperial charter, declaring it a free city. No local lord could impose taxes or tolls on its merchants. No foreign ruler could seize its ships without consequence. Overnight, Lübeck transformed from just another port into something far more dangerous, a sovereign player in the game of empires. But autonomy alone didn't make Lübeck the Hanseatic crown jewel. Geography did. Wedged between the Baltic and North Sea trade routes, it became the perfect hub. Ships from Norway carrying timber could unload there, while wagons laden with German wool rumbled east toward Novgorod. And then there was the salt, the white gold of the medieval world. Lübeck controlled access to the salt pans of Lüneburg, a resource so vital it could preserve fish for export or seasoned meals for kings. Whoever held Lübeck held the keys to Northern Europe's pantry. Yet the real masterstroke came with the Kontors system. In 1256, Lübeck merchants secured rights to build the first Hanseatic trading post in Novgorod, a walled compound called the Peterhof. Inside, German traders lived under their own laws, judged by their own officials, immune from Russian interference. It was a merchant's dream, a slice of home on foreign soil. The Kontors wasn't just a warehouse, it was a fortress of commerce, complete with its own church, jail, and strict rules. No drinking after curfew, no fraternizing with locals. Even marriages required Hanseatic approval. Soon, Lübeck's legal codes became the League's blueprint. Its town hall hosted the first Hanseatic, the assembly where merchant delegates settled disputes and set policies. Its courts punished cheats with a brutality that made others think twice. A merchant caught selling spoiled grain might be nailed to a door by his ear. A captain who abandoned his cargo during a storm could lose his right to trade entirely. Harsh, absolutely. But in a world where trust was the only currency, Lübeck's ruthlessness built something unprecedented, a trade network where deals made in whispers held more weight than royal decrees. By the 14th century, Lübeck wasn't just a city, it was an idea. Its crest, a double-headed eagle, flew on seals from London to Bergen. Its merchants brokered treaties between kings. And when the League needed to flex its muscle, it was Lübeck's ships that blockaded ports or embargoed entire nations. Funny thing, though, for all its power, the League never had a formal capital. No throne, no palace, just a network of men who understood one truth. In the end, gold spoke louder than crowns, and in Lübeck it spoke with a German accent. The Baltic Sea wasn't just a battleground, it was a chessboard, and the Hanseatic League played for keeps. By the 1300s, their ships weren't merely trading, they were carving an empire from the waves. Take Visby, the bustling Gotland port known for its wealth and walls. For years, its merchants operated independently until Hanseatic vessels encircled the harbor in 1361. The message was clear: join or be crushed. Visby's gates swung open, and with them the League gained control of the island's treasure, amber, furs, and access to the icy waters of the north. But brute force wasn't their only weapon. The Hanseatic League mastered the art of the deal, weaving alliances with Scandinavian kings who desperately needed their goods. In Norway, where harsh winters left towns starving, Hanseatic grain shipments became lifelines. In return, exclusive trading rights. Bergen's brigand district became a Hanseatic stronghold, its wooden docks stacked with dried fish bound for Europe. The League even meddled in royal politics, backing Danish and Swedish factions that promised favorable terms. When King Valdemar of Denmark grew too bold, Hanseatic ships blockaded Copenhagen until he surrendered their privileges. Outmaneuvering pirates required cunning of a different sort. Hanseatic captains sailed in convoy, their decks lined with archers. They pioneered route maps marked with safe harbors and hidden shallows, like the Salt Road, where barrels of Lüneburg's white gold snaked inland, and the Herring Trail, where fleets chased silver shoals from Scania to Flanders. Some ships carried false manifests to mislead raiders, others flew neutral flags until the last moment. Yet the true secret to their dominance lay in something subtler: information. Hanseatic merchants kept meticulous ledgers tracking prices from Novgorod to London. A storm delaying a wool ship in Bruges, prices in Riga would spike within weeks. This web of knowledge let them dictate markets, squeezing out rivals who couldn't compete. By the 1400s, the Baltic wasn't just a Hanseatic lake, it was their counting house, and every wave whispered profits. Stretching across medieval Europe like a web of commerce, the Hanseatic League's Kontors weren't just trading posts, they were sovereign islands of German law in foreign lands. Picture the Peterhof in Novgorod, a walled enclave where Hanseatic merchants lived under their own rules, barred from marrying locals or even stepping outside after dark without permission. Its church bells tolled for German services only, and its jail held any merchant foolish enough to smuggle Russian furs without paying the League's cut. But Novgorod was just the beginning. Take the Steelyard in London, a riverside fortress of timber and stone where the scent of Baltic rye mingled with Flemish wool. Here, Hanseatic traders enjoyed unheard of privileges: exemption from English taxes, their own courts, even the right to weigh goods with their own scales. When King Edward IV tried to revoke these rights in 1474, the League retaliated by cutting off English cloth exports to the continent. Within months, London's docks lay empty and the king backed down. Then there was Bergen's Briggen, a labyrinth of creaking wooden warehouses where cod from Arctic waters dried on racks under the midnight sun. German merchants lived here year-round in strict segregation, forbidden from teaching locals their language lest trade secrets slip out. A clerk caught sharing market prices with Norwegians could lose his position, or worse, his hand. The Kontors ledgers recorded every barrel of fish, every bale of grain, ensuring the League's grip on Scandinavia's food supply never wavered. But perhaps the most cunning operation lay in Bruges, where the Hanseatic Kontor played banker to half of Europe. Instead of physically moving goods, merchants began trading debt notes, paper promises that could pass hands a dozen times before actual silver changed hands. When the Count of Flanders imprisoned Hanseatic traders in 1358, the League didn't send warships. They simply pulled every merchant out of Bruges for 3 years, starving the city of trade until its leaders wept for mercy. These weren't just business outposts, they were choke points carefully placed where rivers met seas, where kingdoms depended on their goods. A Hanseatic Kontor could flood a market with cheap grain to bankrupt local rivals one season, then withhold iron shipments to bend a rebellious duke to their will the next. And always, the ledger books kept score not just of coins earned, but of debts owed, favors called in, and kingdoms reminded who truly held the purse strings of the medieval world. Imagine 70 cities, each with its own agenda, sitting down to argue over tariffs, treaties, and trade routes without a single king to force them into agreement. That was the Hanseatic Diet, the League's most revolutionary invention. Unlike the crowned heads of Europe ruling by divine right, this gathering of merchants and mayors in Lübeck's vaulted hall operated on something far more fragile: consensus. Delegates from Bruges to Riga would arrive armed with grievances and ledgers, knowing one misstep could cost their city its place in the most lucrative trade network on earth. The Diet's genius lay in its simplicity. Each member city had one vote, whether it was mighty Lübeck or tiny Rostock. No edict passed unless a majority agreed, and enforcement relied not on swords but on cold, calculated self-interest. When a prince in Prussia dared to seize Hanseatic goods in 1435, the Diet didn't send soldiers. They issued a Verhanstung, a total embargo. Overnight, no Hans ship docked in his ports, no Hans silver financed his wars. Within months, the prince surrendered, his coffers empty, but cooperation didn't always come easy. Take the bitter clash between Cologne and the Wendish cities over Rhine River tolls. Cologne, richer and more independent, resisted lowering fees. The Wendish faction retaliated by rerouting trade through Hamburg, starving Cologne of its lifeblood, wine shipments from France. After 3 years of stalemate, the Diet brokered a compromise so precise it listed toll rates down to the last penny per barrel of herring. Such disputes revealed the League's fragile truth. It thrived not because its members always agreed, but because the cost of walking away was too high. What made the Diet extraordinary wasn't just its power, it was the sheer improbability of its existence. In an age when dukes and bishops settled disputes with armies, these merchants pioneered something radical: rules over ruthlessness. Their meeting minutes, etched in meticulous Gothic script, show debates over harbor fees lasting days, yet ending with handshakes, not bloodshed. When the King of England arrested Hanseatic traders in 1470, the Diet's response was to freeze all English wool exports until every merchant was released. No declarations of war, no burned villages, just the silent, suffocating pressure of commerce withheld. This was governance by spreadsheet centuries before the term existed. The Diet's clerks tracked which cities paid their dues, which violated trade pacts, even which merchants married outside the League, a breach that could get them blacklisted. And when factions deadlocked, they turned to an ancient merchant trick. The Staalhof in London might delay Flemish cloth shipments to pressure Bruges, while Riga's wheat stores could be unleashed to sway Novgorod. Every move was calculated, every concession measured in ledger lines. Yet for all its sophistication, the Diet's greatest strength was also its fatal flaw. Without a central army or monarch, its power relied entirely on mutual need. As new trade routes emerged and nations grew stronger, that need began to fray. The Diet could bully a single prince, but it couldn't stop the tides of history, or the day when its members finally asked why they needed Lübeck's permission to sell their goods. The Hanseatic League didn't conquer with swords, they strangled economies with ledgers. Timber, grain, and fur weren't just commodities, they were weapons, and the League wielded them with chilling precision. Take the winter of 1284, when Norwegian fishermen dared to sell stockfish directly to English buyers, bypassing Hanseatic middlemen. The League's response was a masterclass in economic warfare. Every Hanseatic ship abruptly left Bergen's harbor, no salt for preserving fish, no grain to feed hungry towns. Within months, Norway's coastal villages teetered on starvation, and its king, desperate to save his people, crawled back to the bargaining table, granting the League a monopoly on Norway's fish trade for the next century. But fish were just the beginning. In the dense forests of Livonia, the League cornered the timber market by buying up every sawmill along the Daugava River. Need mast-worthy pine for your ships, only Hanseatic-approved ports could sell it at triple the price. When rival Dutch traders tried to undercut them, the League unleashed its most potent weapon, the Staperecht, a rule forcing all goods to be unloaded at Hanseatic cities first. A Dutch captain carrying Prussian rye couldn't sail straight to Flanders. He had to stop in Lübeck, pay unloading fees, and watch Hans merchants skim the best grain before he could move on. Grain, though, was where the League's grip turned vise-like. In 1438, when Polish nobles tried selling wheat directly to France, Hanseatic spies in Gdansk reported the breach. Within weeks, every Hanseatic port from Riga to Amsterdam refused to load Polish cargo. Ships rotted at the docks, harvests molded in granaries. By the time the Poles relented, the League had rewritten contracts to take 60% of profits and installed their own inspectors to count every bushel. The real brilliance lay in their subtlety. Unlike kings who paraded their power, the League preferred silent pressure. A rumor about spoiled rye in Novgorod could collapse prices in Bruges. A shortage of salt in Lübeck might force Venetian traders to sell at a loss, and when all else failed, they deployed the ultimate sanction, the Verhanstung, a total trade ban that could cripple cities for years. After Bruges imprisoned Hanseatic merchants in 1358, the League didn't just withdraw, they convinced every other Kontor to blacklist the city. For 3 years, Bruges market stood empty, its once bustling squares silent, until its leaders signed a humiliating surrender on the deck of a Hanseatic cog. What made these tactics so devastating wasn't just their ruthlessness, it was their predictability. The League played the long game, ensuring everyone knew defiance meant ruin. Dutch chroniclers wrote of merchants whispering Hanse like a curse, while Russian princes stocked extra grain just in case the League's next embargo left their people hungry. For 400 years, this network of shopkeepers and ship captains outmaneuvered emperors because they understood a simple truth. In the medieval world, hunger and gold were sharper than any blade. Gnarled oak timbers groaned under the strain of North Sea waves as a Hanseatic cog plowed through the storm, its square sail taut against the wind. What made these ships extraordinary wasn't just their strength, it was their design, a revolution hidden in plain sight. Unlike Viking longships that rode low in the water, the cog sat high like a floating fortress, its sides towering over would-be borders. That elevated freeboard wasn't just for show. It let these vessels carry 500 tons of cargo, enough grain to feed a city, while still outmaneuvering pirates. And then there was the secret weapon, a stern-mounted rudder, a radical departure from the side-steering oars used since Roman times. Fixed to the ship's spine with iron braces, this single innovation gave cogs pinpoint control even in gale force winds, turning them into the semi-trucks of medieval trade routes. But true mastery lay in the details. Walk the deck of a reconstructed cog like the Ubina von Bremen, and you'll find clinker-built hulls, overlapping planks sealed with tar-soaked animal hair that flexed with the waves instead of splintering under pressure. Below deck, massive crossbeams acted like ribs, distributing weight so evenly that a ship could ground itself on tidal flats to unload cargo, then float away unharmed when the tide returned. Even the sails told a story of innovation. Dyed with woad to resist mildew, reinforced with leather at stress points, they could be reefed quickly when storms hit, a lifesaver in the Baltic's infamous squalls. The League didn't just build ships, they built ecosystems. Shipyards in Danzig became assembly lines of empire, where timber from Prussia met Dutch rope and Swedish iron. A single yard could produce 30 cogs a year, each identical enough that any Hanseatic crew could step aboard and know where every rope and barrel belonged. This standardization was their silent advantage. When Bruges needed emergency grain shipments after a flood, the League could muster a fleet within days, every ship equally fast, equally sturdy. Yet the cog's greatest legacy might be what it carried beyond cargo, influence. When English kings saw Hanseatic ships unloading Flemish wool without paying duties, they demanded their own cogs. But lacking the League's network of repair docks and seasoned pilots, English vessels floundered. Even the mighty Venice, queen of Mediterranean trade, struggled to replicate the cog's Baltic dominance, because these weren't just boats, they were floating pieces of a system, honed over centuries to exploit every current, every coastal wind, every loophole in medieval maritime law. Storm season revealed their true brilliance. While other traders hibernated in port, Hanseatic cogs sailed year-round, their broad bows smashing through ice-choked waters. Captains wielded rudder books, handwritten guides with coded notes on hidden reefs and safe anchorages passed down like family secrets. In one famous incident, a Lübeck captain navigating foggy Skagerrak spotted a rival Venetian galley foundering in the shallows. The cog's shallow draft allowed it to glide past unharmed, its crew tossing a single barrel of herring to the stranded sailors as a mocking reminder. In these waters, the League's ships ruled supreme. By the 1400s, the sight of a Hanseatic cog's distinctive rounded stern and twin crow's nest struck fear, or grudging respect in ports from Iceland to the Black Sea. Pirates learned to avoid them, kings schemed to copy them, and merchants whispered that the devil himself must have taught the League to build such vessels. But the truth was simpler. In an age where most ships were lucky to last a decade, Hanseatic cogs sailed for 40 years or more because their builders understood something radical. The real treasure wasn't the cargo, it was the ship. Beneath the bustling docks and crowded market stalls of Hanseatic cities lay a shadow war one fought not with swords but with ciphers and whispers. Every merchant knew the risk. A rival learning next season's salt prices could undercut your entire cargo. so the League developed a language of secrets. Ledgers weren't just account books, they were labyrinths of coded symbols. A circle around a number might mean the price was negotiable, while a dash through a commodity's name signaled it came from a blacklisted supplier. In Lübeck's archives, pages of seemingly random doodles, a fish here, a barrel there, actually mapped out safe routes past Danish toll collectors, but codes alone weren't enough. The League cultivated spies, pfeffersack or pepper sacks, disguised as humble traders. These agents infiltrated rival ports, bribing clerks for manifests or eavesdropping on wine-soaked conversations in Bruges taverns. One legendary operative, Hans von Koln, spent years as a scribe in the Bergen Kontor, secretly copying shipping schedules to help Lübeck divert herring shipments away from Dutch buyers. When caught, his punishment was swift. The League's private court ordered his right hand nailed to the Kontor's gate, not for betrayal but for getting caught. Speed was their lifeline. While most medieval messages moved at walking pace, Hanseatic couriers raced across Europe on horseback, changing mounts at prearranged inns. A letter from Novgorod to London could arrive in 18 days, half the usual time. These riders carried more than correspondence. They transported market prices sealed in wax-stamped tubes. In 1421, when Genoese traders tried cornering the Baltic grain market, Hanseatic couriers spread false news of a bumper harvest in Prussia. By the time the ruse was uncovered, Genoa had already sold its reserves at a loss. The most audacious scheme involved counterfeit seals. In the 1450s, Danzig merchants intercepted a shipment of English wool bound for Flanders. By replicating the guild seals with stolen wax, they rerouted the cargo to Lübeck, leaving the original buyers baffled when empty carts arrived in Bruges. When challenged, the League's magistrate simply shrugged. No Hanseatic laws prohibited creative redirection, yet their greatest weapon was silence. The Schweigepflicht, or vow of secrecy, bound every member. Break it and you faced more than exile. Your family's trade rights evaporated, dooming generations. This omerta ensured that when Venice sent envoys to bribe Hanseatic shipwrights for cog designs, not a single craftsman spoke, even as the Republic offered chests of gold. For centuries, this web of deception gave the League an edge no army could match. Rivals might copy their ships or undercut their prices, but without the whispered warnings, the forged manifests, the bribed harbor masters, they were always 3 steps behind. In the archives of Tallinn, one crumbling parchment sums it up best: a merchant's warning to his son, scrawled beneath columns of disguised numbers. Trust no ledger you didn't write yourself, and never let them see you smile when the price is wrong. The Teutonic Knights rode into the Baltic as holy warriors but stayed as merchants, and that's when the trouble began. At first, the Hanseatic League and the Order were uneasy allies. The Knights provided security along the Prussian frontier, slaughtering pagan raiders who threatened Hanseatic convoys. In return, the League funneled weapons, grain, and silver into the Order's coffers. For decades, this marriage of convenience held. German merchants grew rich off Prussian timber and amber, while Teutonic castles kept trade routes safe. But by the late 1400s, the balance of power shifted. The Knights weren't just crusaders anymore, they were businessmen, and their ambitions collided violently with the League's monopoly. Take the siege of Visby in 1398. Once the jewel of Gotland's trade, the city had resisted full Hanseatic control for years. When the Teutonic Order marched in under the pretext of restoring order, they weren't wearing crosses, they were carrying ledgers. The Knights seized Visby's customs houses, imposed brutal tariffs, and even tried rerouting Russian fur trade through their own ports. For the League, this wasn't just betrayal, it was a declaration of economic war. What followed was a masterclass in cold-blooded realpolitik. The Hanseatic cities couldn't challenge the Order's armies directly, so they struck where it hurt most: the purse. Lübeck's merchants secretly financed rebellious Prussian nobles, smuggling weapons disguised as barrel staves. Danzig, the League's eastern stronghold, began withholding the Order's iron shipments, crippling their ability to forge new swords. Then came the ultimate blow. In 1454, when the Teutonic Knights lost the 13 Years' War against Poland, it was Hanseatic bankers who dictated the peace terms. The Order had to pawn their very castles to Lübeck's creditors, reducing these once mighty warriors to tenants in their own fortresses. Yet the League's vengeance had a twist. As the Teutonic Order crumbled, Hanseatic cities didn't just reclaim lost trade, they absorbed the Knights' best tricks. The Order's network of fortified warehouses became blueprints for new Kontors. Their spy networks, once used to hunt pagans, were repurposed to track competitor ships. Even the Knights' meticulous record-keeping found its way into Hanseatic ledgers, with one key difference. Where the Order wrote in Latin about souls saved, the merchants scribbled in Low German about profits made. By the time the Teutonic Knights faded into history, the Hanseatic League had turned their rivals' collapse into a golden age. Prussian grain flowed freely again, but now with Lübeck's tariffs. Amber from Königsberg reached Paris faster, but only through Hanseatic middlemen. And in Visby's ruins, a new generation of merchants rebuilt the docks, not under the cross of crusaders, but under the double-headed eagle of the Hans. The Victual Brothers didn't just raid ships, they burned entire ports to the ground, laughing as their crews tossed flaming barrels into warehouses of Baltic grain. These weren't ordinary pirates, they were a brotherhood of ex-mercenaries, runaway monks, and disgraced nobles turned sea-wolves. By 1390, they'd carved out a kingdom of chaos, holding castles along the Scandinavian coast and demanding tribute from any ship bold enough to sail their waters. For the Hanseatic League, this wasn't just nuisance, it was existential. Every stolen cog, every ransomed captain chipped away at the fragile trust binding their trade empire. The League's response was unprecedented. Rather than waiting for kings to act, Lübeck's merchants took matters into their own hands, pooling funds to hire the very men who'd once terrorized them, privateers. These weren't noble knights but hardened sea dogs like Klaus Störtebeker, a renegade with a price on his head and a knack for sinking ships. The irony was delicious, using pirates to hunt pirates. Störtebeker's fleet, funded with Hanseatic silver, prowled the Baltic like wolves, sinking Victual Brothers' vessels with brutal efficiency, but the pirates fought back with equal fury. In one notorious raid, they stormed Bergen's Kontors, smashing the Hanseatic scales used to weigh fish and replacing them with their own rigged measures. The climax came at Stockholm, where the Victual Brothers had turned the city into their personal fortress. For 3 years, the League's embargo had starved the pirates of supplies, but they clung on, feasting on stolen wine while Stockholm's citizens gnawed on shoe leather. Then, in 1402, the Hanseatic cities launched their masterstroke, a joint fleet of 40 cogs crammed with German crossbowmen and Danish mercenaries. The siege that followed was less a battle than a spectacle of medieval shock and awe. Ships armed with early cannons pounded the walls while sappers tunneled beneath to collapse entire towers. Yet the real victory came after the smoke cleared. When the last Victual Brother was dragged in chains to Lübeck's marketplace, the League didn't just execute him. They staged a theatrical trial, reading aloud every stolen cargo manifest as evidence. The message was clear: defy the Hans and even kings wouldn't save you. For decades afterward, Baltic mothers whispered to misbehaving children, "Be good or the Hans will send their ships." The pirates were gone, but the legend of their downfall became the League's sharpest deterrent, proof that merchants could wield swords when ledgers weren't enough. Brick by red brick, the Hanseatic League rebuilt the northern world in its own image. Walk through Lübeck's Holstentor Gate today, its twin towers studded with arrow slits disguised as decorative arches, and you're stepping into a merchant's vision of power, fortifications dressed as civic pride. This was brick Gothic, a style that spread from Stralsund to Tallinn, where local stone was scarce but clay pits were plentiful. Hanseatic architects didn't just build walls, they coded messages in mortar. The stepped gables of Danzig's merchant houses weren't just pretty. Their steep angles prevented snow buildup that could collapse roofs during long Baltic winters. Riga's House of the Blackheads, with its intricate facade of saints and grotesques, served as both trading hall and propaganda. Look how rich and pious our boys are. But the League's real cultural weapon was language. Low German, the Latin of the Baltic, crackled through harbors from London to Novgorod. It wasn't the tongue of poets or priests, but of deals sealed over barrels of salted herring. Hanseatic scribes standardized it into a mercantile shorthand, stripping away dialect quirks until a trader from Bremen could haggle in Bergen without needing an interpreter. Even foreign rulers bent to its dominance when the King of Sweden negotiated with the League. Treaties were drafted not in Swedish or Latin, but in the guttural vowels of a Hamburg fishmonger. Fashion became another silent ledger of influence. Hanseatic merchants wore their wealth deliberately. Dark woolen robes lined with Russian sable, belt purses chained to their waists to deter cutpurses, seals of office hanging heavy around their necks. In Bruges, locals mocked these Eastland men for their austere style until Flemish tailors started copying the cut of their cloaks, realizing the wide sleeves hid pockets perfect for smuggling gemstones past customs. Then there were the feasts. A Hanseatic banquet was theater disguised as supper. At Lübeck's Skiffergesellschaft Inn, merchants dined under model ships suspended from the ceiling, a not-so-subtle reminder that their fortunes sailed on those same vessels. Tables groaned under Westphalian ham cured with Lüneburg salt, Swedish saffron buns, and Rhenish wine served in goblets stamped with the League's eagle. These weren't just meals, they were edible maps of the Hanseatic world, each dish a calculated display of reach. Yet the League's most enduring cultural imprint might be the calendar itself. Ever wonder why stockfish markets from Aberdeen to Gdansk still traditionally opened on St. John's Day? Because the Hanseatic Diet decreed it in 1382, syncing trade cycles across 50 ports. Even time in the medieval north flowed on Hanseatic tides. The gilded ledger books of Lübeck's town hall hid secrets darker than any Baltic storm. In 1450, when the city's treasurers cracked open the iron-bound chest where Hanseatic taxes were stored, they found not silver, but stones wrapped in parchment. The ensuing scandal ripped through the League like a cyclone. Mayor Marcus Mayer, once celebrated for brokering peace with Denmark, stood accused of skimming guild funds to build himself a riverside palace. His accomplices, including the Kontors chief scribe, had falsified manifests for a decade, diverting amber shipments into private warehouses. The punishment was swift and brutal. On a frostbitten morning in 1451, Lübeck's burghers watched as Mayer and 6 others were led to the scaffold, their once fine robes replaced by sackcloth. The executioner's sword fell not just on necks but on the myth of Hanseatic unity. This wasn't isolated betrayal. In Danzig, inspectors discovered harbor masters taking bribes from Dutch traders to underreport grain shipments. Rostock's wine tax collectors had invented phantom taverns to pocket duties. Even the Steelyard in London wasn't immune. Its German comptroller was caught selling insider knowledge of wool prices to Florentine bankers. The rot went deeper than greed. It struck at the League's founding principle, mutual trust. A merchant cheating his partners wasn't just breaking rules, he was unraveling the very fabric of an empire built on handshake deals. The fallout exposed a fatal flaw. As the League grew richer, its safeguards hadn't kept pace. Contour walls that once kept rivals out now trapped corruption within. Younger merchants raised in luxury saw the Hanse as an inheritance rather than a covenant. Some flaunted their wealth like the Hamburg trader who gilded his ship's prow, a shocking display in a culture that prized discretion. Others exploited loopholes like the Bergen fishmongers who soaked stockfish in brine to inflate weight before weighing. Lübeck's response was characteristically ruthless. A new office, the Oberkranherren, Overcrane Masters, was created to audit every Kontors books. whistleblowers received a cut of recovered stolen goods, an early example of incentivized honesty. But the most chilling reform was public shaming. Embezzlers were paraded through streets wearing shandmasken, grotesque iron masks depicting pigs or demons before being banished from every Hanseatic port. Their names were etched into black books, ensuring no future generation could reclaim trading rights. Yet the damage lingered. When Novgorod's Russian princes learned of the scandals, they began demanding upfront payments rather than trusting Hanseatic promises. Dutch traders, long excluded from Baltic routes, seized the moment to undercut League prices, whispering that Hanse partnerships were a noose woven from silk. Even the Teutonic Order, still licking wounds from earlier defeats, mocked the League's hypocrisy. How could they enforce contracts across kingdoms when they couldn't police their own? The corruption trials left more than corpses in their wake. They revealed a truth no ledger could sugarcoat. The Hanseatic League's greatest enemy wasn't kings or pirates, but the ceaseless human hunger for more. And unlike blockades or embargoes, this was a threat no fleet could sink. England's wool had long been the lifeblood of Hanseatic fortunes. Raw fleece shipped from London's docks to Flemish weavers, then resold across Europe at staggering markups. But when Henry VII seized the English throne in 1485, he saw not a partnership but a parasite. The Steelyard, that walled Hanseatic enclave on the Thames, enjoyed privileges no English merchant could match: exemption from tolls, their own courts, even the right to judge crimes committed by their own. For 2 centuries, the League had treated England as little more than a sheep pasture with a crown. Henry aimed to change that. His first move was surgical. In 1487, Tudor agents quietly began buying up unfinished English cloth from rural weavers, bypassing Hanseatic middlemen. The quality was crude compared to Flemish luxuries, but the price, half what the League charged, made it irresistible to German traders themselves. Soon Hamburg's warehouses bulged not with Flemish tapestries, but with cheaper English kerseys, sold back to the League's own customers. The irony was exquisite. Hanseatic ships were now profiting from the very goods undermining their monopoly. Then came the hammer blow. Henry's negotiators dusted off an obscure clause in the 1474 Treaty of Utrecht, which had ended an earlier trade war. The document stipulated that Hanseatic privileges relied on reciprocal rights for English traders in Baltic ports, rights the League had systematically blocked for decades. Armed with this parchment, Henry's diplomats marched into the Steelyard and delivered an ultimatum: open your eastern ports or lose your London haven. The League's response was pure arrogance. Lübeck's burghers assumed England would buckle, as it always had after all. Where else would they sell their wool? But Henry had prepared for this moment. Over the past 5 years, he'd secretly cultivated Dutch and Spanish merchants hungry for English cloth. When Hanseatic ships abruptly left London's docks in 1493, Spanish caravels swooped in to fill the void. For the first time in living memory, the Steelyard stood empty while foreign competitors feasted. What truly terrified the League wasn't just lost profits, it was the collapse of their information monopoly. English traders, now venturing directly into the Baltic, brought back detailed maps of Prussian grain routes and Livonian timber stands. A Hanseatic captain could no longer claim storms delayed the shipment when his customers knew the weather had been calm. Henry's masterstroke came in 1496 when he granted his own merchants a royal charter to compete directly with the Hanse, the merchant adventurers. Unlike the League's rigid hierarchy, this new guild thrived on flexibility, undercutting Hanseatic prices by sailing straight to Scandinavia with wool and returning with Scandinavian iron. By 1500, Lübeck's ledgers showed Baltic grain profits down by 40%. The message was clear: the age of unchallenged Hanseatic dominance was ending, and England had struck the first mortal blow. Yet the League's real failure was one of imagination. They'd spent centuries outmaneuvering pirates and princes, but couldn't conceive that a sheep-farming island might rewrite the rules of the game. When their delegates finally crawled back to Henry's court in 1502, ready to negotiate, they found the Tudor king had moved on, his gaze now fixed on New World horizons the Hanseatic League would never reach. While the Hanseatic League tangled with England, a far deadlier rival emerged from the marshy lowlands of the Netherlands, one that didn't just challenge their trade but rewrote the rules entirely. Dutch shipyards began churning out flights in the 1500s, vessels so revolutionary they made Hanseatic cogs look like relics. With their shallow keels and bulbous hulls, these ships could glide into estuaries too tight for cogs, loading grain from Polish river towns without paying a single toll. More crucially, they needed half the crew. Where a Hanseatic cog required 30 men to handle its heavy rigging, a flight sailed with just 12. The math was brutal. Dutch merchants could ship timber from Riga to Lisbon for a third the cost, undercutting Lübeck's prices before the League's ledgers even accounted for the loss. The Hanseatic response was characteristically blunt trade embargoes. In 1512, Lübeck declared Amsterdam verhanst, banning all League merchants from doing business there. Dutch ships caught carrying Hanseatic goods were seized, their cargoes dumped onto auction blocks in Danzig. But this time, the old tactics backfired spectacularly. The Dutch simply rerouted. When the League blocked Baltic ports, they sailed west to the New World, trading Spanish silver for Caribbean sugar. When Hanseatic agents sabotaged their North Sea herring nets, Dutch fishermen invented the V-Leet floating factories that gutted and salted fish right on deck, eliminating the need for Kontor-controlled drying racks. Then came the knockout blow. The Dutch bypassed the Hanseatic middlemen entirely. In 1585, Amsterdam merchants pooled funds to create the Compagnie van Deventer, a shipping consortium that sent flights straight to Novgorod for furs and tallow. No Lübeck tariffs, no Visby waymasters, just Dutch captains handing Russian trappers sacks of silver in exchange for pelts loaded directly into their holds. The League's spy network, so adept at tracking Baltic grain shipments, was blindsided by the time they realized the scale of the operation. Dutch fur coats were already hanging in Parisian boutiques at half the Hanseatic price. What made the Dutch unstoppable wasn't just better ships or smarter routes. It was their willingness to burn the old playbook. While Hanseatic guilds clung to rules forbidding non-member investment, Amsterdam's stock exchange let cobblers and bakers buy shares in voyages. Where the League saw piracy as a threat, the Dutch embraced it, funding privateers like Piet Hein to plunder Spanish treasure fleets, then laundering the loot through legitimate trade. Most damning of all, they treated the League's collapse not as a tragedy but as an opportunity. When the 30 Years' War devastated German ports in the 1600s, Dutch financiers swooped in, offering loans to rebuild, at interest rates that made Lübeck's burghers choke on their wine. The Hanseatic League had spent centuries mastering every trick in the medieval trade manual: embargoes, monopolies, price fixing, but the Dutch wrote a new manual. And in that mercantile revolution, the League's greatest weakness was finally laid bare. They knew how to dominate a system, but not how to change one. While Lübeck's merchants debated guild bylaws in candlelit halls, Amsterdam's traders were reinventing capitalism itself, turning the Baltic from a Hanseatic lake into a Dutch pond. The cogs still sailed, their proud eagles fluttering in the wind, but the tide had turned and it carried flights. The cracks in the Hanseatic League's foundation didn't come from cannon fire or pirate raids. They came from within, as rival cities turned on each other like wolves over a dwindling carcass. Take Cologne and Lübeck, once brothers in trade but now locked in a bitter Cold War. Cologne, nestled on the Rhine, had grown fat on wine exports to England and Flanders, while Lübeck's Baltic-focused merchants saw no reason to share their hard-won privileges. When Cologne dared to negotiate a separate deal with English wool traders in 1497, Lübeck's response was swift and vicious, a blockade that left Cologne's ships rotting in port until the deal was scrapped. But the damage was done. Trust, the glue holding the League together for centuries, had begun to dissolve. By 1518, the fractures had spread like rot through a ship's hull. That year's Hanseatic Diet in Lübeck devolved into chaos, with delegates shouting over each other like fishmongers in a squall. Wendish cities demanded stricter control over Rhine trade, while Prussian ports like Danzig argued for looser rules to compete with the Dutch. The debates dragged on for weeks, each faction vetoing the other's proposals until no decisions were made at all. The meeting's final record reads like a tragicomic farce: no consensus on tolls, no agreement on piracy, no unified stance on England. For an organization built on swift collective action, this paralysis was a death knell. Meanwhile, the world outside was moving on. Younger merchants, tired of guild restrictions, began bypassing the League entirely. In Hamburg, a clique of renegade traders formed the Elbe Syndicate, pooling funds to charter their own ships to Lisbon, a brazen end run around Lübeck's control. When the League threatened blacklisting, the syndicate simply laughed. They'd already secured backing from Spanish financiers. Even the Kontors, once impenetrable fortresses of Hanseatic power, became liabilities. Novgorod's Peterhof, rigidly enforcing century-old rules, found itself empty as Russian fur traders shifted business to Dutch intermediaries offering better terms and fewer curfews. The League's refusal to adapt bordered on self-sabotage. When Antwerp emerged as Europe's new financial hub in the 1520s, Hanseatic merchants clung to their cash-only policies, rejecting bills of exchange that Dutch and Italian traders used to move money across borders. A Lübeck silk importer might wait months for a wagon of silver to arrive from Venice, while his Florentine competitor settled deals with a flick of a quill on paper. The ledger books tell the story. Between 1500 and 1550, Hanseatic trade volumes halved while Antwerp soared. What made this collapse so insidious was its slow-motion inevitability. Like a cog taking on water, the League didn't sink overnight. It listed. City by city, privilege by privilege, the edifice eroded. Bremen struck private deals with Sweden. Rostock welcomed Dutch ships despite embargoes. Even the once mighty Hanseatic became a ghost of itself, its decrees ignored as casually as tavern gossip. The double-headed eagle still flew over Lübeck's gates, but its wings had been clipped by the very merchants who once swore allegiance. The League didn't fall to invaders, it bled out from 1,000 self-inflicted cuts. The printing press couldn't have arrived at a worse time for the Hanseatic League. When Martin Luther's 95 Theses began circulating in 1517, they didn't just challenge the Pope, they shattered the fragile religious unity that had glued Hanseatic cities together for centuries. Take Danzig, the League's powerhouse in Prussia. For generations, its merchants had knelt beside their Catholic counterparts in St. Mary's Basilica, praying for safe voyages under the same vaulted ceilings. But as Lutheran pamphlets flooded the docks, whispered arguments turned violent. In 1525, Protestant rioters stormed the city council, hurling Catholic officials into the Matlawa River and smashing the Hanseatic seals that bore the Virgin Mary's image. The League's response was paralyzed silence. How could Lübeck excommunicate a city for heresy when half its own burghers were secretly humming Lutheran hymns? Religion had always been the League's silent partner. Chaplains on Hanseatic cogs blessed voyages in Latin, regardless of a sailor's hometown. Contour churches from London to Novgorod held Mass under identical crucifixes, reinforcing that German merchants shared more than trade routes, they shared God. But Luther's doctrine of individual faith struck at this communal bedrock. Why tithe to a distant church when salvation came through personal belief? Why honor Hanseatic feast days if local priests denounced them as popish superstition? The rift spread like a crack in winter ice. Cologne remained fiercely Catholic, its merchants funding lavish processions to prove loyalty to Rome. Hamburg embraced Lutheranism so fervently that its churches whitewashed over medieval frescoes of Hanseatic patron saints. The toll wasn't just spiritual, it was devastatingly practical. When Danzig's Protestant rebels seized control in 1577, they didn't just burn Catholic relics, they tore up the city's Hanseatic charters, declaring their scales would no longer bow to Lübeck's papist weights. Flemish buyers, long accustomed to standardized Hanse measures, now faced Protestant Danzigers using reformed calibrations. Deals collapsed, ships languished. The League's meticulous uniformity, painstakingly built over 4 centuries, crumbled in a doctrinal squabble. Even language fractured. The League's Low German lingua franca, once laced with Latin prayer terms like Mercator and Negotium, now sprouted Lutheran vocabulary. Jouissance conscience replaced biked confession in contracts. Sermons in Steelyard churches switched from unifying Latin to divisive vernaculars, making a Bergen trader feel like a foreigner in Bruges, the final irony. The League's own success hastened its undoing. Those very trade routes that carried Baltic grain to Europe now ferried Reformation ideas at terrifying speed. A Lutheran tract printed in Wittenberg could reach Riga in 10 days faster than a Hanseatic embargo notice. By 1540, the Hanseatic debated whether to ban heretical books alongside spoiled herring, but it was too late. The League had spent centuries mastering commerce across kingdoms, only to watch its soul split along the one border no ledger could reconcile: faith. The 30 Years' War didn't just ravage the fields and cities of Germany, it burned the last remnants of the Hanseatic League to ash. What began in 1618 as a religious squabble over Bohemia's crown spiraled into a continental bloodbath, and the League's once proud trade hubs found themselves caught in the crossfire. Take Magdeburg, a Hanseatic jewel on the Elbe River. In 1631, imperial troops under Count Tilly stormed its walls, slaughtering 20,000 civilians and reducing the city to smoking rubble. The Kontors ledgers, packed with generations of debt records and price agreements, became kindling for soldiers' campfires. For merchants who'd spent centuries meticulously tracking every barrel of herring and bolt of cloth, this was more than destruction, it was the erasure of their very system. But the real horror wasn't just the violence, it was the League's helplessness. When Swedish armies marched into Lübeck in 1632, demanding free passage for their troops, the city's burghers could only watch as foreign soldiers commandeered their warehouses. The Hanseatic, once capable of toppling kings with embargoes, now begged for scraps at peace negotiations. Dutch and Danish envoys scoffed at their demands, carving up Baltic trade routes like a pie while Hanseatic delegates stood empty-handed. Even the League's ships, those legendary cogs that had once ruled the waves, became floating targets. Spanish privateers captured entire fleets off Flanders, selling their cargoes in Amsterdam to fund more war. The war exposed the League's fatal weakness. It had no teeth. Without a unified army or central treasury, its members were lambs in a wolf pack. Bremen bribed Swedish generals for protection. Hamburg declared neutrality only to see its docks burned by vengeful Danes, and in the League's eastern strongholds the devastation was apocalyptic. Polish-Lithuanian raiders sacked Danzig suburbs in 1635, torchlight flickering on the scorched faces of the very merchants who'd once financed the Teutonic Knights. The Kontors, those walled fortresses of commerce, became refugee camps. Novgorod's Peterhof, which had survived Mongol raids and Russian winters, collapsed under the weight of starving families crammed into its storerooms. By 1648, when the Peace of Westphalia finally extinguished the flames, the Hanseatic League was already a ghost. Its trade networks lay in ruins, its debts unpaid, its members scattered. The Dutch and Swedes now controlled Baltic shipping lanes, their flags fluttering over ports where Hanseatic eagles once flew. Even Lübeck's famed Holstentor Gate, that symbol of merchant pride, stood pockmarked with cannonballs, its double-headed eagle chipped and fading. The war didn't just weaken the League, it revealed the brutal truth that power had shifted. Nation-states with armies and navies now called the shots, not guilds of shopkeepers arguing over ledger lines. The last Hanseatic convened in 1669 wasn't even held in Lübeck, but in the backroom of a Hamburg tavern, where 6 aging merchants raised a toast to memories before dissolving the alliance for good. No fanfare, no protest, just the quiet click of tankards acknowledging what everyone already knew. The age of the Hansa was over. The pewter goblets clinked in Lübeck's drafty council chamber, their dull echo a far cry from the thunderous toasts that once shook the rafters during the League's glory days. Only 9 delegates had bothered to attend the 1669 Hanseatic, just 9, where once 70 cities had jostled for influence. The empty benches told the story better than any chronicler could. Bremen's envoy nursed his wine in sullen silence, while Hamburg's representative fiddled with a ledger whose entries grew thinner each year. Even Lübeck's once proud double-headed eagle crest above the door had lost half its gilding, the wood beneath showing through like exposed ribs on a starving man. What made this gathering so tragic wasn't just its scarcity, it was the ghost of what had filled these halls before. Picture the Hanseatic of 1400, when delegates from Novgorod to Bruges had debated blockades and tariffs with the intensity of generals plotting war. Back then, the League could embargo entire kingdoms with a stroke of the pen, its merchant princes negotiating as equals with emperors. Now, the few remaining envoys bickered over trifles, whether Rostock should pay an extra 3% toward maintaining the long-defunct Bergen Kontor, or if Wismar's overdue membership fees could be waived in exchange for a shipment of subpar timber. The grandeur had curdled into petty accounting. The reasons for this irreversible decline weren't written in the meeting minutes, but they hung thick in the air. The world had moved on. Nation-states now controlled trade with armies and navies, not guild agreements. Amsterdam's stock exchange had rendered the League's cash-only traditions as obsolete as parchment ledgers. Even the Baltic, once a Hanseatic lake, now teemed with Dutch flights and English merchantmen who laughed at the idea of paying Lübeck for the privilege of sailing it. Most damning of all, the League's own members had lost faith. Cologne had long since thrown its lot in with the Rhine electors. Danzig answered to the Polish crown. Hamburg, eyeing the booming Atlantic trade, flirted openly with the Dutch. The bonds of mutual interest that once held the Hanse together had frayed beyond repair, replaced by the cold calculus of self-preservation. When the final vote came to dissolve the alliance, it passed without protest, just a weary chorus of ayes. The scribe's quill scratched across parchment one last time, recording not a rebirth but a quiet surrender. Outside, the winter wind rattled the shutters of empty Kontors, their storerooms gathering dust. The delegates shuffled out into the twilight, their cloaks flapping like the tattered sails of a ship too waterlogged to ever leave harbor again. No speeches marked the occasion, no chronicles would call it a tragedy. It was just business, and business, like the tide, had ebbed away. The Hanseatic archive should have been the ultimate treasure trove, a meticulous record of 4 centuries of deals, betrayals, and world-shaping commerce. Instead, what remains is a puzzle box scorched by fire, shredded by war, and picked clean by time. Take Lübeck's town hall, where clerks once penned contracts in iron gall ink under the watchful eyes of merchant elders. In 1683, a careless baker's oven ignited a blaze so fierce it melted the lead seals affixed to centuries of treaties. The heat curled parchment into brittle black roses, erasing debt records, secret alliances, and perhaps most tantalizing, the original membership rolls that could have revealed which cities abandoned the League first and why. Then there's the Great Purge of 1702, when Prussian officials ransacked Danzig's Hanseatic vaults. Seeking evidence of tax evasion, they tossed entire ledgers into the Matlawa River, where saltwater dissolved ink into indecipherable ghosts. Among the lost, the Black Book of Novgorod, a ledger rumored to list every bribe paid to Russian princes to keep the Peterhof's gates open. Without it, historians can only guess how much silver it took to grease the wheels of Eastern trade, or when those payments stopped buying loyalty. But not all gaps are accidents. In 1520, as Luther's Reformation swept through Baltic ports, Rostock's Protestant mobs stormed the Kontors scriptorium, hurling Catholic-tainted ledgers onto bonfires. One eyewitness wrote of account books curling in the flames, their margins crammed with notes about special shipments to Rome, likely the League's secret papal tithes. Were these payments evidence of hypocrisy, given the Hanse's famed mercantile pragmatism, or proof that even merchant kings still knelt to higher powers? The truth now drifts as ashes over the Baltic. The most tantalizing losses, though, are the deliberate ones. When the 30 Years' War reached Stralsund in 1628, the city council ordered the burning of all correspondence with Swedish commanders. Documents that might have revealed whether Hanseatic cities secretly aided Protestant warlords against Catholic allies. Later, in Bergen, retreating German merchants systematically shredded the brigands' guest logs, leaving historians to wonder, did Dutch spies really infiltrate the Kontor by posing as fishmongers? Or was the League covering up its own members' side deals with competitors? These gaps have spawned a cottage industry of speculation. Some scholars pore over water-stained receipts, searching for coded references to the Flanders incident of 1494, a rumored mass embezzlement that might explain the League's sudden credit collapse. Others fixate on the missing England protocols, purportedly detailing secret negotiations with Tudor spies. Then there's the infamous Ghost Ledger of Visby, a 13th century account book that allegedly listed payments to pirate captains for protection services. Found in a Latvian attic in 1936, it vanished during World War II, leaving behind only a clerk's notation about 30 barrels of Rhenish wine for our friends in the Narrows. Perhaps the greatest mystery isn't what was lost, but why so much survived. Fragments endure in unlikely places. A Hamburg wine merchant's diary tucked inside a psalm book, a Danzig shipmaster's log repurposed as pastry wrapping in Copenhagen. These shards hint at a deeper truth, that the League's real ledger wasn't parchment but people. The descendants of Hanseatic traders still whisper names like van der Brug or Hertzwig like heirlooms, their family vaults holding rusted keys to Kontors that no longer exist. The archives may be gutted, but the legacy lingers in the slant of a grocer's handwriting, the stubborn persistence of Low German loanwords in Baltic ports, even the way modern shippers still avoid certain routes not because of charts, but because their great-grandfathers muttered about cursed waters where Hanseatic ships once vanished with all hands. Historians will keep sifting through the wreckage, but some secrets may stay buried. After all, the League's greatest trick was making an empire out of ink and trust. When the ink fades and the trust dies, what remains is just echoes, the faint scratch of quills in a Lübeck counting house, the creak of a cog's rudder in the night, and the wind carrying away the last unread pages. Walk through Lübeck's medieval quarter today, and you'll catch flickers of the Hanseatic League in the unlikeliest places: a weathered stone eagle above a bakery door, a street sign reading Hansaplatz, even the red brick warehouses along the Trav River, now converted into boutique hotels with names like the old Trading Post. These aren't just relics, they're spectral reminders of a mercantile empire that refuses to fade entirely. In Tallinn, bartenders still serve Hansa beer beneath vaulted ceilings where German merchants once haggled over furs. Bergen's Brigand Wharf, a UNESCO site, preserves the original wooden arcades where stockfish was weighed under Hanseatic seals, though today's tourists snap selfies where ledger books once lay. But the League's afterlife isn't confined to nostalgia. Every summer, Rostock's Hanse Sail Festival draws millions to watch replica cogs glide into harbor, their sails emblazoned with the double-headed eagle. Visitors stuff their faces with Pfefferkuchen spice bread once traded as currency, while actors in period hose barter fake silver for imaginary barrels of salt. The irony is delicious, a glorified medieval cosplay funded by the same EU subsidies that now bind these cities in a new trade alliance, because the real ghost of the Hanse isn't in the pageantry, it's in the policies. The European Union's single market could be the League's bureaucratic reincarnation. Tariff-free trade zones, check. Standardized regulations so a Latvian candle burns as safely as a Portuguese one. The Hanseatic Stapelrecht did it first, ensuring Lübeck's weights matched Novgorod's. Even the EU's freedom of movement echoes the League's Hanseatic passports, which let merchants traverse borders without feudal harassment. When Dutch politicians gripe about German austerity, they're replaying 15th-century squabbles between Cologne and Lübeck over who should foot the bill for pirate patrols. Yet the most haunting parallel lies in the unspoken rules. The League thrived on trust handshake deals between merchants who knew cheating meant exile from every contour from London to Riga. Today's EU relies on similar invisible glue. A Polish farmer trusts Greek olive oil labels because Brussels says so, just like a medieval draper in Bruges trusted Gdansk's linen measurements. When Brexit shattered that trust, it wasn't so different from Henry VII tearing up Hanseatic privileges, a gamble that left England scrambling for new partners, just as Britain now courts deals with Australia and India. Even the League's failures cast long shadows. The Hansa collapsed partly because it couldn't adapt to nation-states with armies and central banks. Now, as the EU struggles to enforce unified foreign policy while members like Hungary and Poland defy Brussels, historians spot eerie déjà vu. The League's demise proved that commerce alone can't bind fractious cultures forever, a lesson the EU is learning in real time. But perhaps the most telling ghost is the one you can't see, the quiet persistence of Hanseatic pragmatism. Modern Hamburg's port, still Germany's gateway to global trade, operates on the same principle that once made Lübeck rich: geography is destiny. Dutch flights may have replaced cogs, but the Baltic's currents haven't changed. And in Brussels' backrooms, where technocrats hash out fishing quotas and grain subsidies, the whispers of long-dead merchants linger: profit over pride, deal over dogma. The League's eagles may have crumbled from city gates, but their shadow still falls across every container ship gliding through the Øresund Strait, loaded with goods that would have made a medieval Pfeffersack grin. The Hanseatic League's rise and fall isn't just a medieval tale. It's a blueprint, a cautionary story etched in the ledgers of history that modern trade blocs like the EU and ASEAN are still deciphering. At its peak, the League mastered something revolutionary: collective bargaining on a continental scale. When Lübeck's merchants huddled in candlelit halls to set uniform tariffs or blacklist rogue traders, they were pioneering a system that would one day underpin the European Union's single market. Today's Brussels bureaucrats debating fishing quotas or standardized product regulations are unwitting heirs to the Hanseatic Diet's playbook. The League proved that fragmented cities or nations could wield far more power as a bloc than alone. When Dutch upstarts threatened their monopoly, it wasn't Lübeck's navy that struck back. It was a coordinated embargo across 70 ports, a medieval precursor to the EU's collective sanctions. Yet the League's greatest strength also became its fatal flaw. Their obsession with control bred rigidity, a refusal to adapt that echoes in modern trade disputes. Take the flight ships that Dutch rebels used to outmaneuver Hanseatic cogs. These sleeker, cheaper vessels needed half the crew and could navigate shallow rivers bypassing tolls. Instead of adopting the new technology, the League doubled down on their clunky cogs, clinging to tradition like a drowning sailor to driftwood. Sound familiar? It's the same myopia that left British automakers building gas-guzzling sedans while Japan dominated with fuel-efficient compacts, or the EU's sluggish embrace of digital markets compared to Silicon Valley's agility. The League's Kontors, those walled fortresses of commerce, functioned much like today's special economic zones, but their refusal to update rules like banning night trade in Novgorod or forbidding marriages with locals eventually strangled innovation. The parallels to modern unions go deeper than just trade mechanics. The Hanseatic League's collapse mirrors the EU's existential crises. centrifugal forces pulling members in opposing directions. Cologne's rebellion against Lübeck's dominance in the 1500s isn't so different from Hungary's Viktor Orbán defying Brussels today. Both expose the Achilles heel of collective systems when the cost of compliance outweighs the benefits members bolt. The League's downfall wasn't caused by pirates or kings, but by Danzig and Hamburg realizing they could cut better deals alone. Brexit, anyone, but perhaps the most haunting lesson lies in the League's failure to evolve beyond economics. They had no answer to the Reformation's ideological divide, just as the EU stumbles over cultural clashes between secular Western states and conservative Eastern members. The League's ledger books held meticulous records of fish prices, but no column for the spiritual hunger tearing their cities apart. Modern alliances repeating this mistake risk their own irrelevance. Trade deals can't glue together societies split by nationalism or climate denial. Yet for all its missteps, the Hanseatic model got one thing profoundly right: trust. Their system thrived because a merchant in Bruges could ship wool to Riga without seeing it first, relying solely on the League's reputation. That invisible framework of credibility, now mirrored in EU product certifications or ASEAN trade protocols, remains the bedrock of global commerce. The League's eagles may have faded from city gates, but their legacy flies on every cargo ship crossing today's tariff-free waters, proof that even the mightiest empires rise and fall on the simplest of equations. Cooperation beats isolation, but only if you're willing to change course when the winds shift. Every storm that churns the Baltic Sea whispers the same tantalizing rumor. Somewhere beneath its murky depths lies the lost fortune of the Hanseatic League. Fishermen from Rostock to Tallinn spin tales of cogs laden with amber and silver, their splintered hulls scattered across the seafloor like broken treasure chests. One persistent legend claims the Godeskalk, a Lübeck merchant ship, vanished in 1489 with a cargo so precious, its manifest was burned to ash by the city council. Divers still scour the Bay of Gdansk for its wreck, lured by sonar glimpses of what might be iron-bound chests or just coral-crusted rocks. Then there's Visby's Gold Street, where locals swear Hanseatic merchants buried hoards during the Victual Brothers raids. In 1934, a Gotland farmer ploughing his field unearthed a cache of silver coins stamped with Lübeck's eagle, fueling speculation that the League's wealth wasn't lost but hidden. Archaeologists dismiss most of these stories, pointing out that medieval merchants preferred liquidity to buried treasure. Yet the myth persists, fed by discoveries like the 1996 recovery of the Bremen cog. Its hold empty but its structure eerily intact, as if its cargo had been carefully removed before sinking. The real conspiracy lies in Lübeck's subterranean labyrinth. Beneath the town hall's vaulted cellars, a network of tunnels snakes through the bedrock, some leading to forgotten chambers sealed since the 30 Years' War. City records vaguely mention emergency repositories for guild silver during sieges, but modern scans hint at voids behind the brickwork. In 2018, a restoration team accidentally broke through a wall near the old wine market, revealing a narrow passage that terminated abruptly in collapsed rubble. The official explanation, a medieval sewer, the Whispers, a deliberate collapse to hide the League's last reserves. Skeptics argue that the Hanseatic League's true wealth was never gold but information, the trade routes, debt ledgers, and blackmail stashed in those lost archives. They're probably right. Yet every few years, when a storm exposes another shipwreck or a construction crew strikes iron under a Copenhagen street, the old hopeful question resurfaces: what if the Hanse's eagles are still guarding one last secret? Beneath the shifting sands of Baltic coasts and the silt-choked waters of forgotten harbors, archaeologists are uncovering secrets that force us to rewrite the Hanseatic story. Take the discovery in 2019 at the mouth of the Trav River, where divers found the near-intact hull of a 14th-century cog buried under 10 feet of mud. The vessel, now called the Lübeck Merchant Roman 7, wasn't just another wreck. Its timbers held revolutionary clues. Tree ring analysis revealed the oak came not from Prussia, as expected, but from forests near Bruges, proving the League shipbuilders sourced materials far beyond their claimed territories. Even more telling, the cargo hold contained Venetian glass beads alongside Russian furs, evidence of shadow trade routes that bypassed official Kontors entirely. CGI reconstructions show how these ships acted as floating contraband hubs, their captains smuggling luxury goods under layers of legally traded salt and grain. Then there's the Bergen Kontor excavation, a 20-year project that's turned Norway's Briggen Wharf into a time capsule. Beneath modern tourist shops, archaeologists uncovered 17th-century fish bones layered with German beer steins, physical proof of the League's infamous drinking bans. But the real bombshell came in 2017, when ground-penetrating radar exposed a hidden network of tunnels under the Kontor walls. These weren't for smuggling, they were escape routes. Scorch marks on the bricks and hastily discarded iron money chests confirm what records only hinted at. When the Great Fire of 1702 engulfed Bergen, Hanseatic merchants abandoned their goods and fled through these passages, leaving behind a snapshot of panic frozen in ash. The most dramatic rewrite, though, comes from Poland's Matlawa River. For centuries, historians assumed Danzig's Hanseatic docks were purely functional. But in 2021, workers installing a sewer line hit a submerged structure, a massive, ornate trading hall preserved in the anaerobic mud. Its walls bore frescoes of merchant ships sailing past mythical sea monsters, while the floor tiles formed a mosaic of the double-headed eagle. This wasn't just a warehouse, it was a propaganda palace designed to awe visiting traders into compliance. The discovery forced scholars to reconsider the League's use of psychological power, proving their dominance wasn't just economic but theatrical. Emerging technologies are revealing even subtler details. In 2023, Swiss researchers applied multispectral imaging to a waterlogged ledger recovered from a sunken cog near Visby. The technique, originally developed for medieval palimpsests, exposed erased entries showing how captains falsified cargo weights to evade tolls. One page even contained salt-stained fingerprints likely from a scribe working on deck during a storm. These aren't just artifacts, they're windows into the daily acts of deception that kept the League's machine humming. Perhaps the most poignant find surfaced last year in Tallinn's harbor. A child's wooden toy horse carved with Lübeck's eagle crest, lost between the planks of a 15th-century dock. It's a reminder that behind the ledgers and blockades were families' merchants' sons playing while their fathers haggled, shipwrights' daughters watching cogs being launched. Archaeology is doing more than updating history books. It's humanizing an empire we once knew only through its balance sheets. Every fresh discovery peels back another layer of varnish from the Hanseatic legend, revealing not just shrewd traders, but fathers and fraudsters, pragmatists and dreamers, men who built an empire on ink, oak, and ambition. The Hanseatic League's legacy is a tapestry woven from equal parts ambition and irony, a medieval superpower that redefined trade, yet crumbled under the weight of its own success. For 4 centuries, this network of merchants proved you didn't need crowns or conquests to build an empire. Ledgers and alliances could bend kingdoms to their will. Their Kontors were the Silicon Valley hubs of their day, their cogs the container ships of the Middle Ages. But like all empires, the League's greatest weakness lay in forgetting that the world moves on. They mastered the art of squeezing profits from Baltic herring and Prussian grain, yet couldn't adapt when Dutch flights and English wool merchants rewrote the rules. Their story isn't just one of rise and fall, it's a mirror held up to modern trade blocks, whispering a warning. Unity without flexibility is just a slow-motion collapse. Yet to dismiss the Hanse as a relic is to miss its ghostly fingerprints on our world. Walk through Hamburg's Speicherstadt at dusk, where brick warehouses once stored spices and silk now house coffee roasters and design studios, and you'll feel it, the same hustle that animated 15th century dockworkers. In Tallinn's Gothic town hall square, the iron rings where merchants chained their goods still jut from the cobblestones, polished shiny by centuries of tourists' fingertips. These cities didn't just survive the League's collapse, they absorbed its DNA, turning trade routes into cultural lifelines. The real magic happens when you step off the guidebook trail. Behind Gdansk's reconstructed facades, hidden courtyards reveal medieval crane mechanisms frozen in time. Lübeck's Niederegger marzipan salon guards recipes as closely as any Hanseatic spice trader hoarded pepper. And in Bergen's Briggen alleyways, the scent of tarred wood and dried cod lingers like a stubborn memory. These places don't just tell the League's history, they let you taste it, touch it, lose yourself in its shadows. So here's the invitation: go chase those shadows, wander the crooked streets of Visby where wildflowers burst through cracks in Hanseatic walls, order a beer in Rostock's Ratskeller where the vaults once stored gilt silver. And when you find that perfect, overlooked corner, a faded merchant's crest above a bakery door, a wharfside tavern serving fish the same way since 1400, drop it in the comments. Because the Hanseatic League's true legacy isn't in textbooks or museums. It's waiting in the quiet moments when you turn a corner in some Baltic backstreet, and for a heartbeat, the modern world falls away, leaving only the echo of cobbled footsteps and the salt-tanged wind off the sea, the same wind that once filled the sails of history's most mercenary dreamers.